This is Relationship Radio, an extension of Marriage Helper International, hosted by renowned marriage and relationship expert Dr. Joe Beam and CEO of Marriage Helper, Kimberly Beam Holmes. We answer your questions directly with research-based principles that you can implement immediately. Regardless of the situation, what we teach will not only make your relationships better, but will also help you to become the best version of yourself along the way. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell to turn on notifications. Turn up the volume and prepare to take notes as we begin this week's episode of Relationship Radio.
It's that time of year. You see, we just passed the season where people give gifts and say all kinds of nice things and enjoy life. And now we have hit the season for divorce filing. That's right. January is traditionally the month when more divorces are filed than any other month during the year. We'll be talking about divorce tonight and particularly why people do it. Hi, I'm Dr. Joe Beam. Welcome to the show. We'll be talking about this tonight in terms of why people want out of a marriage. And you can hear every different kind of reason that you can possibly imagine, but they all really come back to one. Well, I've heard them all. I heard a guy tell me once that he said, I've been married to my wife for 20-something years. We have children that are just about grown. And all of a sudden on Facebook, I ran into the woman that was my high school girlfriend and have come to the realization that God wanted me to marry her instead of the woman I'm married to. And now he's giving me a second chance. And so I'm divorcing the wife that I shouldn't have been with to marry the one that I was supposed to have been with to begin with. I've had others talk about the fact that, I know that what I did was wrong, but I ran into this person and we had a connection and we wound up sleeping with each other. And I know I shouldn't have done that when I was married, but you don't know what it's like. And the relationship I have with this person is so amazing. And so I'm divorcing my spouse and I'm going to go be with him because I can just tell the rest of my life is going to be absolutely amazing. And not long ago, I interacted with a fellow who was involved with a woman who is older than he. He has 2 children under 3. He said that the woman that he's involved with says you should go ahead and divorce your wife and leave those kids and come. It won't affect the kids negatively at all, not in any shape, fashion, or form. How do I know? Well, because I was divorced when my child was young, and my child's now in college, and she's doing great. And so it's going to be great for your daughters as well. And when the guy was interacting with me, and I said, why would you give them up? Why would you do that? He said, the sex with this woman is phenomenal. You can hear every reason. I mean, all kinds of things. We can talk about everything you can come up with, but it all comes back to one basic reason. And interestingly, and we'll talk about this in just a few minutes, that one basic reason often reaches back into childhood. You say, okay, Joe, we've heard you. What's the reason? What's the reason that people want a divorce? Well, if you were going to look in the Bible, for example, and say, why not people divorce? You'll find in the book of Matthew, Jesus says that people want a divorce because their hearts are hard. If you want to look at our modern psychology, which is where I'm going to come from, and you say, why not people divorce? It's because they believe that being out of that marriage is better than being in that marriage. You see, the basic rule of thumb with people is that they don't let go of what they have unless they believe what they're about to grab hold of is better. Or another way to say that is people don't leave what they have unless they believe where they're going is better. And so in the situations I described for you already, these are all people who said, man, the situation that has arisen now, meeting up with an old high school girlfriend 20-something years later. Oh, I've hooked up with this older woman and the sex is phenomenal. Whatever it might be, it's always, I see that as being better than the marriage I'm in now. And so when people want out of a marriage, the basic underlying reason is, I think where I'm headed, actually, think is not strong enough a word. I believe where I'm headed is better than what I have now. Therefore, I'm going to leave this marriage and go to that. You say, well, is that always another person? And the answer is no, it's not always another person. Sometimes the relationship is so bad in the marriage that you're in that a person would see being alone as being better. A lady that I talked to several years ago who talked about how her husband regularly got drunk, and every time he was drunk, he tried to kill her. At least that's what she told me. And she described some of the beatings that she took from him and how he once tried to set her on fire and other things like that. And for her, divorce was actually still the same principle. I'm going to something better, only it was not another person. It was just being without him. That being with you is so bad that I believe where I'm headed is still better than what I have here. And so sometimes people will divorce to get out of a situation because the relationship they're in is so controlling or dominating or dangerous that they feel like just being alone is better. Or sometimes it's because they have decided to enact a new lifestyle that they cannot live if they stay in the marriage. And so they wind up, I really want to go and drink with my friends. I want to go out and dance all night long. And this is not going to work because my spouse is not up for that and doesn't want me to do it. And so what I want to do is leave this marriage so I can live like I want to live, drink what I want to drink, do what I want to do, spend how I want to spend. And even then, you understand that what they're seeing in their own minds is what I'm going to is better than what I have. Now, I'm going to explain in just a moment how that almost always comes out of childhood. But before I do that, let me make sure that you're hearing what I'm saying and to explain why more divorces take place in January than any other month or are filed in January more than any other month, typically speaking. One is that some people don't want to file the divorce during the holiday season because Thanksgiving and Christmas tend to be family events, and it's like, I can't do this to my children during this time frame, or I don't want to do this to my spouse during this time frame, and so I will wait till afterwards. So let's just get past the holidays, and then I'll do it. So that's one reason that January is that kind of a month. Another reason has to do with sometimes it's during that holiday period that they just finally admit to themselves how miserable they are in the relationship that they have. Like, I don't want to be here. And so if they've already found a paramour, a lover, an affair partner, whatever phrase or term you want to use for that, it may be that they begin to long even more intensely for the relationship with that person because of the holidays and wanting to be able to share the holidays with him or her. So sometimes that's the reason that it happens in the month of January. So it's timing having to do with Thanksgiving and Christmas primarily that motivates the January things. Now, if people want out of a marriage because they believe where I'm going is better than what I have, if that's the case, how does that tie to childhood? Because I've mentioned that it does. Think about it this way. We, and this is pretty well all of us, if there's an exception to this, I don't know it. We, in our childhood, typically did not have the absolutely perfect childhood. I mean, maybe somebody did have the perfect childhood. I don't know. But I don't hear the story from people like, my childhood was amazing. Nothing bad happened. It was wonderful. I wish everybody could live my childhood. Now, obviously, there are some childhoods that are much better than others. We know that. And you can come through childhood and be happy. I'm not saying that every kid goes out of childhood all screwed up. I'm not saying that at all. But typically, most of us somewhere in childhood wind up with what I will call vulnerabilities, or if you prefer the word, susceptibilities based on something that we didn't get, something that we wanted, something that we craved. And I'm not talking about typically things like a new bike. I'm talking about more often emotions. Such as, I wanted my home life where I was growing up to be one that felt safe and secure, and I never felt that safety because I never knew if Dad would kind of come back home again. Or Dad had already left, and now my mom had a lot of different boyfriends. One of my dear friends, his mom was married, I'm forgetting, it was either 11 or 12 times before he finished high school. Now, and so it would be like, I want this relationship. I want a relationship with a father. I want a relationship with a mother. I want to feel safe. I want to feel appreciated. And some of us come out of childhood feeling that we were controlled and dominated and never were loved for who we are. but only for what they wanted us to do. And when we did it, we were accepted. And when we failed to do it, just as a parent or both parents wanted, we felt rejected. And therefore, we come out of that with this tremendous need for unconditional love. Another fellow I know runs let's just call it a retreat. It's not exactly that. It's actually more intense than that. Where young men who have, and these are teenagers, who have drug problems come into his program and stay for a while. And he does a lot of very intense things there. He told me once, I have never had a teenager with drug or addiction problems come into my program that didn't have a hole in his heart for his father. I said, okay, can you say that so I can understand it better? He said, they all have daddy holes, that they needed this from dad or that from dad, feeling loved, feeling safe, feeling secure, those kinds of things, and they didn't happen. And these particular kids, at least, have tried to fulfill that by the drugs that they take or the addiction they've gotten into. And sometimes it doesn't come from your parents, it can come from your peers. For example, you may be a person that is not as physically blessed as others. As a matter of fact, maybe you're rather plain, or you have been made fun of all of your life because other kids were mean and called you things like ugly. I remember talking to a college student just a few years ago who said that throughout her teenage years, all of her friends, or at least alleged friends, let's say that, called her ugly. And so she had a great need, but it wasn't coming from mom and dad necessarily. It was coming from the fact that I feel rejected by my peers. There's something wrong with me. Some of us grew up in homes with alcoholic parents, either a dad or a mom or both, and felt the insecurity that came with that and learned how to be very private and protective and not share that information with other people. I mean, I could describe a bunch of different things here, but what I'm hoping you understand is how this creates a susceptibility. So this is a very old story. It's a true one that I don't tell a lot, but every once in a while I remember a young man, and I'm talking about a real person here. This is not a made-up thing, who was obese when he was in high school and didn't have, as a matter of fact, I don't think he ever dated at all when he was in high school. Didn't go to the senior prom, nothing, none of those kinds of things because of the fact that he felt so ugly and people made fun of his weight. He was big enough and et cetera, et cetera. He wound up going to a Christian university to major in Bible, not because he necessarily wanted to, but because that was the deal his parents made with him. If you go to this Christian university and you major in Bible, we will pay for your education. Otherwise, do the best you can on your own. And so he did. And as he was doing that, he had to take some classes about speaking and discovered that he had a great gift for oratory. I mean, this guy was an amazing speaker. He could stand in front of people and just hold you in the palm of his hand as he talked. And so he stayed with a Bible major. He graduated. He went into ministry. It didn't take long for him to get a good church with such a giftedness. And then he had that kind of surgery that will help you lose the weight, some kind of a bypass thing or something. And so he had this surgery and wound up losing a lot of weight. And when he got down to, the size that people would expect him to be, all of a sudden had a lot of female attention because of the fact that he now appeared to be handsome. And in addition to that, standing in front of all these people with that great oratorical skill and speaking, people were just attracted to him. His personality was magnetic. His speaking was fantastic. Now, what kind of a susceptibility or vulnerability do you think would exist in a guy like that? Now, he did marry while he was in college, and so he's got a wife, and he's a pastor of a church. What's going on? He begins to get this female attention, and he doesn't know quite how to deal with it. Why? Because he's got this vulnerability, this susceptibility. But think about it with me, if you will. Who were the females that had rejected him when he was a kid? Well, they were teenage girls. So, and I'm, by the way, not justifying anything this guy did because everything he did was terrible. He should have not done it. But he wound up having an affair with a 13-year-old girl. Now, she had gone into puberty early, so she was developed to some degree, and he winds up, and she, of course, becomes totally infatuated with him and just amazed by the attention she got from him. And he is enjoying this because it's fulfilling that susceptibility. But let me go back and explain something about this. Okay, if you actually, you might want to write this down in front of you. On the left-hand side, just write the word susceptibility / vulnerability. Now, start moving to your right a little bit. And the next thing you do is put possibility. You say, what are you talking about? I'm going to try to help you understand what finally leads to the divorce. If we have a susceptibility or vulnerability, whatever it might be, and for this guy, it was being attracted to teenage girls because that's where he was rejected. It can be all kinds of different things for different people. A lady once called me after one of my programs, and this was several years ago, quite a few years ago. She said, I'm in my 40s, but I'm not going to tell you which year, because the next thing I'm going to tell you, you could try to figure out who I am, and I want to be anonymous. And I said, okay, talk to me. She said, I'm in my 40s. I was once Miss Alabama and went to the Miss America contest. Okay. I'm not going to go try to look up people in your age group and find out which ones were Miss Alabama back in those days. But okay, I understand. She said, I've always been extremely pretty. And I said, okay, very good. I'm not hearing this as egotism because I know she's headed to a problem. And she said, and now if there are younger women around, rather than looking at me, men look at them. And I don't have any identity anymore. So he was a person whose vulnerability or susceptibility stemmed from the fact that she believed that her worth and value had to do with being beautiful physically. And as she began to age, and I don't know who she was, but I'm imagining that even in her 40s, she was probably still extremely pretty. But people were looking at the 20-somethings rather than the 40-something, and she didn't know who she was anymore. Now, take those two stories, the one about the pastor and the one about her. Think about that as susceptibility, vulnerability. Move that one step to your right, and you see the word possibility, which means, is there a possibility that something could occur that would take advantage of the susceptibility and vulnerability? Now, stay with me for a minute. For example, suppose you grew up in a home with an alcoholic, either dad, mom, or both, which makes you likely, or at least more likely, let me say it that way, more likely to become an alcoholic yourself. And so let's say that you have a penchant for that. You have a predilection toward being a drunk. But you live in a country that allows no alcohol, one of the Middle East countries, where the Muslims are in power and they're against alcohol altogether. Well, then you could have a vulnerability or susceptibility, but no possibility. And if the possibility doesn't exist, then you have no problem. But in America, possibilities exist for nearly everything. Now, if you go one more step to the right, write the word probability. Because even if a possibility exists, it doesn't necessarily mean that your weakness, your susceptibility, your vulnerability is going to be taken advantage of. There's always a possibility, you understand, particularly in this country. But if you go one more step, then there's a probability. And you say, oh, what are you talking about now? Well, this pastor that I was talking about starts, I assume this is the way it happened. I know some of the story, but not all. He's speaking all around the country, by the way, by this time, because he's so amazing as an orator. But he's also teaching the teenage class at his church that includes the 13-year-olds. And this one particular 13-year-old who had developed a little earlier than some girls do, began to pay a lot of attention to him and wanted to talk to him after class and hang out and those kinds of things. And he did that. Now, most of us would admit to ourselves, if we knew what they were, we would admit to ourselves what our vulnerabilities, our susceptibilities. Actually, let me back up on that. Based on my experience, I think most of us would not admit to ourselves what they are. So let me say that more honestly. We don't look at it. We don't try to find out what it is. I don't think this guy ever sat down and thought, wow, if I were going to wind up doing something wrong or bad, where might be my areas of temptation? Where are my susceptibilities? What are my vulnerabilities? But this 13-year-old girl's paying attention to him, and then they wind up spending time together when nobody else is around. So she comes to the church, she comes in his office, she'll sit there with the door closed and talk to him. And that finally leads to them having some secret meetings just because they're friends. Maybe they meet at the table at the back of the park. where nobody ever comes, but, it's okay because we're just friends. Nothing bad would ever happen. And by doing those kinds of things, he has moved from possibility into probability. And so back with the former Miss Alabama, what's happening with her? By the way, this conversation took place with her more than 30 years ago. So if she's still alive, she's in her 70s now, or maybe even 80s. I don't know. And what happened with her is that the possibility existed, of course, that she could be taken advantage of because she needed her beauty, her physical beauty, affirmed. And then when she goes to parties and things like that, which apparently she did a lot of, apparently a very social creature, and men would pay attention to those younger women, she would make sure to become a great conversationalist with guys, not necessarily the youngest guys there, but with men. And in those conversations, if those men began to pay any attention to the other women than her, she would actually raise the ante by becoming a little bit suggestive and flirting in those conversations. And then it finally led to some of those guys would say, well, let's leave here and go get a drink somewhere. And she would. And what happens? She told me that she had had 7 extramarital affairs, and she didn't know how to stop because when those men were in bed with her, she felt beautiful. But do you see how the susceptibility, vulnerability became a possibility and then finally became a probability? And after probability, of course, comes reality. So this young man, the pastor, winds up having an affair with a 13-year-old, which is illegal in all kinds of ways. It's a wonder that her father didn't end his tenure on this planet. I'm serious, as he could have been shot to death by that father. Or here's this woman who was the former Miss Alabama, and she's having the situation because of the fact that she wants to feel beautiful. And so if you look back, you can see those kinds of things like that all the way back along the line, such as I was sexually molested when I was young, and it continued and continued and continued. And whether they understand this about themselves or not, with those particular people, and hear me well, this does not apply to everybody who has been sexually molested. But at least for some of those people who were sexually molested, they begin to see their worth only in terms of sexual activity. And so it's not that unusual that some of them, by the time they go through puberty, wind up being very sexually active with a lot of people. Why? Because only when that's happening do I feel lovable, do I feel acceptable. And so there's the vulnerability, susceptibility that goes into possibility, which is always existing in America. And probability is I'm paying too much attention to this guy, I'm spending too much time with him or this girl, or I'll just take a drink to help me deal with the fact that I can't cope with all the anxiety, or my life seems so empty. I've got this big daddy hole. And because I can't handle the misery, the easiest thing available to me is something that'll put me chemically altered. So I can take this pill, or I can snort that, or I can shoot this thing over here, or I can smoke that. And the whole idea being because of the fact that I'm still dealing with my pain from my childhood, because I do not feel accepted for who and what I am. And so this person then moving closer and closer to that by hanging out with people who do those things, putting himself or herself in places where those things occur, where they exist, where they're available. Now, do you understand that that's what often leads people who wind up getting married into things that make them want to divorce? So, for example, if the woman, and I'm just giving an example here, not trying to teach a solid psychological principle that applies to every woman in the situation. But let's say a woman had little attention from her father and didn't feel very loved by him. She winds up married to a guy in her age group. They go along for a few years, and then some distinguished guy comes along and starts paying attention to her, older, and she finds herself strangely attracted to him and begins to have conversations with him over time, usually not immediately, that become more and more risque or more toward areas that they shouldn't be talking about, which eventually winds up in some bedroom somewhere. And now she's, quote, madly in love with him, end quote, and doing all these things that she shouldn't do, and now she wants out of her marriage. Why? Well, I'm in love with this other guy. That's why I want out. Now, I'm not saying that this guy is her father. He's not. She may not even be aware of the fact that the susceptibility, vulnerability in her came from childhood. All she's thinking now is, what I have is not as good as what I want, which is to be with this guy as much as I possibly can. And so that's what I want to go do. I want to be with him. I'll give up my husband. I'll give up my children. They'll be fine. This man will be amazing for me for the rest of my life. And so, while the principle I gave earlier is absolutely true, people don't leave what they have unless they believe what they're going to is better, quite often. As a matter of fact, one of my counselor friends who actually runs a counseling center with other counselors working under him said, actually, Joe, I've never seen an exception to this. So maybe it's everybody that winds up in severe marriage problems where they want out of their marriage. There's something back in childhood from, he says all, I will say at least a lot, that has set up a vulnerability, susceptibility. They finally went through possibility, and the trouble came when they got into things that made it more probable. So, a young lady, beautiful young lady, as a matter of fact, I've known her most of her life, actually. If you lined up 100 people and said, pick out the person you think has never done anything wrong, she's the person I would have picked. And she and her husband wound up in one of our workshops because she wound up having an extramarital affair, which was shocking to everybody. Like, if there's anybody who would never do this, it would be you. And in our workshop, she and I talked some because I'd known her since she was a child. I mean, a young child. And she would ask questions like, I still don't understand why I did that. I can't understand what led me to that. Without giving the whole story, basically what it boiled down to is that her dad, who, by the way, is a great guy, he is, and it would kill him to know that this happened. Her dad was always pushing her to do more, achieve more. She would cry if she made a 98 on a test instead of 100 back when she was in school because she needed so much to please her father. Now, he's a good guy. He didn't realize the effect he was having on her, but the susceptibility, vulnerability she wound up with is I need for the authority figure in my life to be happy with me. I need to do whatever I need to do to make that happen. Possibility exists with a beautiful young woman that some authority figure would take advantage of that? Absolutely. She winds up working for an authority figure kind of guy, and he finally, over time, because the conversations get more and more and more intimate as they go along, not even necessarily about sex, just conversations about life and those kinds of things until he eases into that position where she really wants to make him happy because that's how she's been kind of conditioned in life, and he winds up having an affair with her, she of course with him, and is just devastated herself that she had done such a thing. Now, her marriage was saved. Isn't that a wonderful thing? I have no idea what happened to the Miss Alabama because I never knew who she was. The pastor that was involved with the 13-year-old, his marriage was not saved. Oh, and by the way, what kind of susceptibilities, vulnerabilities do you think she brought into adulthood? And what kind of things do you think that she's had to struggle with through her lifetime? So do you hear the principle here? It typically happens in January. It can happen any time of the year, obviously, but typically more in this month than any other. And if people want out of a marriage, it's because I believe that what I'm headed to is better than what I have. Either because of the situation I'm going to be in with that person, situation I'm going to be in with that lifestyle, or the situation I'm going to be in because now you no longer can control me or beat me or abuse me. And a lot of that still goes back to childhood, so that not long ago, a woman was telling me a story that when she was a teenager, her father got mad at her about something one night, took a thin belt. She was wearing blue jeans, and they were kind of tight, beat her buttocks and legs with that belt until he cut through the denim, and she was bleeding quite a bit. He would not let her take them off and take a bath and clean herself up. He made her sleep all night long on a cold tile floor in those bloodied jeans, so that the next morning when she wakes up, that blood is clotted. And as she gets into the bathroom finally to be able to take those jeans off, she's ripping those scabs off, as you would understand. And in that process bled again tremendous pain. Now, what kind of susceptibility, vulnerability do you think that puts in her life? Wanting an authority figure who is kind, gracious, loving, etc., and having tremendous negative reaction toward anybody that in any way physically makes her feel threatened. So what was the double whammy in her life that led her to want a divorce? Well, her husband on one occasion got really angry. Now, I'll go back and tell you more. She got involved with an older man who was a minister. This is not beat up minister night, but also a minister who was warm and kind and friendly. Do you understand how that childhood event led to the possibility, which led to the probability? Those things typically don't happen overnight. They evolve over time, and people go further and further and further into it, which finally led to the reality of the affair. And when the husband finds out, he hits her. And, of course, she instantly flashes back to when she was a teenager, to what her father done, and is like, well, I'm out of here. Being free from you, even if I have to live alone for the rest of my life, is better than being with you because you hit me. Now, she wasn't necessarily going to go after the pastor, which would have been a possibility because of the fact that he was an older, kinder, gentler, sweet man that her father had not been. But do you understand? Do you get the principle so far? Well, I've spent about 30 minutes on this, and I think probably I've talked about it enough to make it clear as to what the real reason is. Did you hear it? People don't leave what they have unless they believe what they're going to is better. So if they're leaving for another person, in their mind, that person is better. If they're leaving you for a different lifestyle, in their mind, that lifestyle is better. If they're leaving you because they can't live with you any longer because of the domination, the control, the abuse. In other words, you've made their lives the proverbial living hell. Then they even see being alone as being better. And that most of the time, and maybe all of the time, it will also tie back into something from their childhood that they're dealing with, which is why, interestingly, you often see people wind up doing things like having an extramarital affair after some significant emotional event in their lives, like, dad died. And then that triggers all these kinds of things happening inside of you. And boom, next thing you know, you've moved into probability. You go through all of that and finally get into reality, and you're doing this other terrible thing over there. By the way, if you're listening and thinking to yourself, wait a minute, is there anything you can offer me that'll help? If you've not been through our website, may I strongly suggest you go to www.marriagehelper, that's marriagehelper, marriagehelper.com.
Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of Relationship Radio. Please refer to the notes in the description to learn more about any resources mentioned in this episode. Please visit our website at marriagehelper.com for more information about our online courses, marriage workshops, and coaching. If you would like immediate help for your marriage situation, then click on the link on the screen to schedule a free marriage strategy call with one of our team members. We exist to help save marriages and strengthen families. We look forward to interacting with you on the next episode of Relationship Radio.